As I said, some Liberal politicians want Parliament to formally declare that what the Islamic State is doing to Christians and other religious minorities is genocide. I spoke earlier to one of the MPs behind this move, frontbencher Michael Sukkar. Michael Sukkar, thank you so much for your time.
Andrew, good to be with you.
The bombing attack on Coptic Christians in Egypt, this is not some isolated incident, is it?
Unfortunately, Andrew, it's not. I mean, this is another tragic event in a series of events around the world, but particularly in the Middle East, that's targeted Christians. We've seen, obviously, the two churches targeting Coptic Christians. We've seen all throughout North Africa, Iraq, Syria, in Pakistan, where an Anglican and Catholic church were bombed last year. So many places around the world where we have majority Muslim countries, we're seeing persecution, certainly suppression of Christians at the most tame, to persecution of Christians, which is most often happening, including in Somalia, Eritrea, many other countries in North Africa, to the most extreme, which is attempted genocide, which is what we're seeing with ISIS.
We've had this genocide, attempted genocide by ISIS now, has been declared as such, genocide by the US and by the European Union. Why do you think we should follow suit?
Well, I think we have to recognise that Christians are the most persecuted minority in the world. Christians now in the Middle East make up 4% of the population of the Middle East. I mean, this is the cradle of Christianity. Now only represents 4% of Christians, and that's because of the things I spoke about: suppression, persecution and genocide, particularly genocide in the case of the Armenians at the turn of last century. So we have to recognise these things are happening. If we can't do that in our parliament, then there's something very wrong, and I think we will. I know there's a lot of support in the parliament, on both sides of parliament, but particularly in the coalition party room, to recognise this self-evident truth. This, unfortunately, what we saw on Palm Sunday in Egypt against the Copts, is not an isolated incident. It is yet another incident targeting Christians for their faith, and it is something that is particularly troubling to Australians who value religious freedom, and if we don't call it out, it's really to our own detriment.
But I'm wondering, the calling out, we've had this, as I say, this genocide named as such in the by the European Union, by America, but we haven't actually seen, as a consequence, any policy change at all. Are you suggesting that we also call out this genocide for a political change or a cultural change, as in, will this finally force the media to recognise what's really going on? Because this seems to be, to me, a story that's been swept under the carpet.
Well, Andrew, both. I think it has to be cultural and political. I'm not a virtue signalling politician. I don't do things just for the gesture in itself.
But sometimes you need to get the debate going.
Correct. You've got to get the debate going. We need to create a cultural shift and an understanding that the most persecuted group in our world today are Christians, whether that be in North Korea or Pakistan or in North Africa or the Middle East. Anywhere where Christians are a minority, they are persecuted and in many cases killed for their beliefs. Now, the cultural change can be led by statements from our parliament, such as that I and others have called for, but ultimately, you're right, there needs to be a political awakening, a political movement that seeks to redress this for countless individuals who just want to practice their faith in peace and unencumbered.
Why has the media been turning largely, not all, there's some exceptions, largely a blind eye to what's going on?
Well, I think there's a couple of factors. I think one, Andrew, is, as you and I have just highlighted, there's another attack against Christians around the world seemingly every day. It starts to lose its newsworthiness. Now, of course, when you have Coptic churches bombed on Palm Sunday, it's newsworthy. But those events are literally happening every day, whether it be a nun murdered simply for obviously displaying clothing that represents her as a nun, whether it be a church being burned in Pakistan or bombed, or whether it be whole villages in Syria, in northern Iraq, that are basically exterminated by ISIS. They literally go house to house. Are you a Christian? And if you are, you're murdered. So I think there's a bit of fatigue because it's happening constantly. I also think there's a slightly more insidious movement here, Andrew, which is almost a perverse coalescing of radical Islamic extremists and the very, very hard, the sort of anarchist left that I describe them in the Western world. It's almost like an enemy of my enemy is my friend, and they both have one thing that they hate, and that's Western civilization. There's, I think, that factor at play too, which...
I suggest, too, that if the media, particularly on the left, were to acknowledge that Christians are persecuted in Islamic countries, that would make people here be a little more doubtful about importing people who could possibly persecute Christians right here. I think there's that fear as well, isn't it?
Well, look, it's hard to understand their motives because as someone, I'm the product of my father, who was a Maronite Christian from Lebanon, who came to Australia in 1966 as an 18-year-old. I suppose I'm someone that just doesn't understand how you could just be able to ignore such atrocities.
And yet they do, and that's what I'm trying to struggle to understand.
And I struggle too, Andrew, and it's difficult to impugn those sort of motives because how could someone be that callous to, in a sense, ignore the plight of millions and millions of Christians around the world?
Well, I'll give you some parts from some figures here. Persecution of Christians in Iraq and Syria is now probably the worst that we're seeing. I mean, Egypt is terrible, but you have a look, Syrian Christians in Iraq have gone from 1.5 million just 14 years ago, the fall of Saddam Hussein, 1.5 million to just 200,000.
Yeah.
This is astonishing. And yet, in the media, this is about a non-story, whereas if Israel has, shoots one Palestinian terrorist dead, that's a huge, terrible scandal.
Well, I mean, as I said at the outset, Andrew, now Christians represent 4% of the Middle East. This is the cradle of Christianity. Once upon a time, Christians were in the majority there, admittedly a long time ago. But each event, each unstable or unsettling event that occurs in the Middle East often gives the majority the opportunity that they need to persecute the minority. In this case, it's Christians. There was a great, a wonderful article in The Australian a couple of weeks ago written by Simon Benson that spoke about the Yazidis and basically the attempted extermination of the Yazidis, the trafficking of women. Obviously, we know about the Nigerian schoolgirls who still to this day, Christian Nigerian schoolgirls have been sold into slavery, and in most cases we still have no idea where they are, those poor souls.
That's correct. And I also remember when Al-Shabaab, Somali-based, went into Kenya and murdered, I can't remember how many, nearly 200 students at a Christian college. It was a Muslim attack on a Christian college. The ABC over 3 nights refused to use the word Christian to help explain this atrocity. Does it concern you that we have so many academic and media figures acting almost as apologists for militant Islam?
It worries me greatly because our silence, in my view, enables them to get away with the worst atrocities. Now, we can never blame somebody's silence as being complicit in the crime, of course, but it does worry me that particularly those hard left, and unfortunately our academia is full of the hard left, that's where they've all seemed to have coalesced over the years, they are less concerned about the crime and more concerned about who perpetrated and who was the victim of it. And if the victim's a Christian, silence.
Correct. Identity politics. Finally, why has the government allowed Yusuf Cat Stevens to come here and hold concerts when this bloke has still never withdrawn his support for the murder of Salman Rushdie, the author, for offending Islam?
Well, Andrew, I must say a few years ago somebody sent me a link on YouTube of, I think that was the offending interview where...
We've just played in my editorial.
Where Cat Stevens basically said that Salman Rushdie did deserve to die for what he wrote, freedom of expression. Obviously, a lot of time has passed since then. I've not seen him in any way display any remorse for those comments. So as a Member of Parliament, this is not the position of the government, but as a Member of Parliament, I do find it quite astounding that he is entitled to enter our country when we know he has those views. That somebody, in the case of Salman Rushdie, a renowned author, a man who has added so much to literature worldwide, deserved to die because he offended a particular mullah in Iran.
Salman Rushdie is still living in fear.
Correct.
Whereas Yusuf Cat Stevens can go on the project and get treated like a hero. Incitement to violence, which in my opinion is what he did in that interview, has never repented, is a reason to deny people a visa.
I completely agree, Andrew.
Let's hope that the Immigration Minister does something. Let's see if he dares. Michael Sukkar, thank you so much for your time.